It was supposed to be just another quiet evening in the city when a man in a simple jacket pushed open the glass door of a popular restaurant. The place was buzzing with its usual rhythm: clinking silverware, soft chatter, the aroma of grilled food drifting through the air. To everyone else, he looked like just another customer coming in for dinner. What no one knew was that this man was the undercover CEO of the very restaurant they were sitting in. He had built the brand from the ground up, but tonight, he wasn't here as the owner. He was here as a stranger, hoping to see what truly happened when the boss wasn't watching. He sat at a corner table, quietly observing. The staff moved quickly, balancing plates, pouring drinks, greeting guests with practiced smiles. At first glance, everything seemed smooth, just as he'd hoped. But then his eyes caught something unusual: a waitress moving between tables, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She greeted guests, but her voice trembled ever so slightly. She carried trays with grace, but her hands shook just enough for him to notice. Something about her didn't sit right with him, and he couldn't look away. Minutes later, she disappeared toward the back of the restaurant. When she returned, her eyes were red, as though she had just wiped away tears. She kept her head down, doing everything she could to hide it, but for the man watching in silence, it was impossible to ignore. The undercover CEO's mission that evening had been simple: to observe his restaurant, find out what really happened behind the polished surface, and understand his employees without them knowing who he was. But now, the mission had turned into something far more personal. As customers laughed and clinked glasses around him, he found himself staring at the waitress who was clearly carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Every time she forced a smile at a table, it looked like it might break at any second. He wondered what could make someone cry in the middle of their shift. Was she being treated unfairly? Was she struggling with something no one else cared enough to see? He had read reports, seen numbers, and approved policies from his office, but this was raw, real, and human. For the first time in a long while, he felt the gap between the numbers on his desk and the reality of the people working for him. The waitress disappeared once again into the back, and the CEO quietly stood up. He wasn't sure what he would say or even what he would do, but something in his heart told him he had to find out the truth. He walked slowly, blending in as just another customer, until he found himself near the staff corridor. From there, he could hear muffled voices, the sound of someone sobbing, and a manager's stern tone cutting through the air. He leaned closer, realizing what he was hearing wasn't just a personal struggle. It was something bigger. And in that moment, the undercover CEO knew his night was about to take a turn he never expected. What he was about to uncover would not only change the life of that waitress, but also force him to question the very foundation of the business he had built. But before he could step forward, a sudden voice from behind froze him in place. The voice behind him was calm but firm, and it sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, the undercover CEO turned, half expecting one of the employees to question why a customer was lingering near the staff area. But it wasn't an employee. It was another diner, a middle-aged man holding his jacket over his arm. Their eyes met for only a moment, and the stranger gave a polite nod before walking past. The CEO exhaled quietly, realizing how close he had been to being noticed. If anyone discovered who he really was, the entire purpose of his visit would be ruined. Still, he couldn't shake the thought of the waitress crying just feet away. Something was happening here, something he couldn't ignore. He returned to his table, trying to blend back in. From across the room, the waitress reappeared, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear and forcing herself into the rhythm of service again. But he could see it in her eyes: she wasn't fine. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they didn't care. Guests were too caught up in their meals and conversations. Even the other servers moved around her as if nothing unusual was happening. Yet he, the man who had created this entire chain, couldn't look away. As he watched, memories began to stir. He remembered the early days of his business, how he had worked long nights, washed dishes, even waited tables himself to keep the doors open. He had promised himself that if he ever succeeded, he would treat his employees like family. That belief had been at the heart of his company's growth, or so he thought. But now, sitting in the very restaurant that bore his name, he wasn't sure if that promise had been kept. Somewhere along the way, policies, profits, and paperwork had replaced the personal connection. And maybe that was why this waitress, someone who should have felt supported, was breaking down in silence. He watched her as she moved to a nearby table with a family of 4. She greeted them warmly, her voice light and practiced, but her eyes betrayed her. The undercover CEO leaned back in his chair, scanning the room for the manager he thought he had heard earlier. The man's voice had been sharp, almost scolding. Was he the reason for her tears? Or was it something deeper, something happening outside these walls? A plate clattered loudly in the kitchen, followed by hurried footsteps and whispers. The waitress excused herself from the table and slipped into the back again. This time, the CEO's curiosity burned stronger. He needed answers, not just for her sake but to understand the reality of his own company. He glanced around, making sure no one was paying attention, and then slowly rose from his seat once more. Near the corridor, he caught a glimpse through the half-open door. The waitress stood with her back turned, her shoulders trembling. The manager, a tall man with crossed arms, spoke in a low but cutting voice. Though the words were muffled by the hum of the restaurant, the CEO caught fragments, phrases like "not good enough" and "last warning." His jaw tightened. This wasn't the way he had built his brand. Something was terribly wrong here. Before he could step closer, the door shut, leaving him staring at his own reflection in the glass panel. For the first time that evening he felt conflicted, not just as an undercover boss but as a human being watching someone struggle right before his eyes. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong move and his cover would be blown. But deep down, he also knew he couldn't just walk away. What was happening to this waitress wasn't just about her. It was about the truth of his entire company. And as he turned back to his table, his heart pounded with one burning question. What else was happening here that no one dared to show him? The undercover CEO sat back down, but his mind wasn't on the menu or the chatter around him anymore. Every detail of the restaurant seemed sharper now. The hurried footsteps of the staff, the subtle glances exchanged between servers, the way the manager moved about the floor with an air of authority that didn't feel welcoming but heavy. It was as if the entire place carried a tension just beneath the surface, invisible to the customers but painfully clear to anyone who looked closely. He couldn't stop thinking about the waitress. She was young but not inexperienced. There was a grace in the way she handled the guests, even when her voice shook. It wasn't just the pressure of the job that weighed on her. It was something more. He wondered how many times she had cried in silence before. How many others had done the same, only for their struggles to go unseen. The reports he'd been given by his executives painted the restaurant as thriving. Profits were up, customer reviews were glowing, and everything seemed perfect. But those numbers hadn't mentioned a woman in tears or a manager whose words cut deeper than any balance sheet ever could. As he tried to piece it together, he noticed another detail. A second waitress, older and quieter, kept glancing toward the younger one whenever she passed by. Her face tightened each time, as though she wanted to step in but couldn't. At one point, their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting look, there was a silent understanding. It was almost as if she knew what the younger woman was going through but had learned to hide her own battles long ago. The undercover CEO's suspicion grew. Was this just one employee's problem, or was the whole restaurant hiding cracks behind its polished smile? A new layer of unease settled over him when a group of kitchen staff stepped out for a short break near the back door. He overheard them whispering, their voices hurried but clear enough to catch pieces. They weren't just complaining about long hours, they were frustrated about schedules being cut, pay being delayed, promises being broken. His stomach turned. He had prided himself on building a business where people felt valued, but here in his very own restaurant, it sounded like people felt overlooked and unheard. The waitress returned to the dining area once more, her expression calm but distant, as though she had built a wall around herself to survive the rest of the shift. The undercover CEO studied her carefully, noting how she avoided the manager's gaze, how her steps quickened whenever he approached. It was becoming clear now. This wasn't just about her emotions spilling over on a hard night. Something deeper was at play, a conflict that had been growing beneath the surface for far too long. And yet, he couldn't reveal who he was. If the staff discovered the truth too soon, the honesty of what he was witnessing would disappear. People would straighten up, put on fake smiles, and he would lose his only chance to see what was really happening. That thought weighed heavily on him. He needed to know how deep the problem went, but he had to play the role of an ordinary diner a little longer. Across the room, a small incident broke out, a customer raising his voice over a delayed order. The younger waitress hurried over, apologizing, her voice fragile but steady. The manager followed close behind, his tone defensive instead of helpful. The situation de-escalated, but the CEO caught the look in the customer's eyes. Confusion at the tension, a sense that something wasn't quite right about the way the staff carried themselves. The CEO felt his chest tighten. He wasn't just uncovering one story. He was beginning to see the outline of something much larger, a culture he had never intended but one that seemed to be taking root in his absence. And the more he observed, the more he realized the truth might not only change this restaurant but shake the foundation of his entire company. Still, one question echoed louder than the rest. If this was what he could see in a single night, what was really happening behind closed doors that no one dared to say out loud? The air in the restaurant felt heavier as the night dragged on. The undercover CEO could almost hear the strain in every laugh the waitress forced, every polite word spoken through clenched teeth. The manager's presence hovered like a shadow over the room, sharp eyes following every move. His expression quick to shift into impatience whenever the staff stumbled, even slightly. The CEO's pulse quickened with each passing minute. He had come here to quietly observe, but what he was uncovering was far more than he had expected. A moment later, the younger waitress slipped while carrying a tray. A glass toppled and shattered on the floor, the sharp sound cutting through the chatter of the restaurant like a blade. Guests turned their heads, some whispering, others frowning. The waitress froze, her face pale, her hands trembling as she scrambled to pick up the pieces. Before she could even gather herself, the manager stormed over. His voice was low but venomous, laced with scorn. Though the customers couldn't hear the exact words, the CEO caught them clearly. "You're an embarrassment. One more mistake, and you're done here." The room seemed to tilt in that instant. The waitress bit her lip, holding back tears, nodding quickly before rushing away with the shards of glass. The undercover CEO gripped the edge of the table, anger tightening in his chest. This was the breaking point. He had witnessed enough to know this wasn't an isolated moment. It was a symptom of something far worse festering within the very heart of his business. But still he had to stay silent, at least for now. Revealing himself too early could shut down the raw truth spilling out before his eyes. As the night wore on, subtle tensions surfaced everywhere. The older waitress slipped into the back for a moment, only to return with the same hollow look she'd worn earlier. A busboy nervously avoided the manager, keeping his head down as though afraid of being singled out. And the whispers from the kitchen staff grew louder, talk of quitting, of feeling trapped, of promises made by the company that never reached them. To the undercover CEO, it was like watching the walls of his carefully built empire begin to crack right in front of him. But then came the moment that pushed everything to the edge. The waitress returned from the back, her eyes redder than before, and placed a bill on a table near his. As she turned to leave, the manager stopped her in her tracks, his hand gripping her arm, not hard but firm enough to make her flinch. The CEO's heart pounded. Customers nearby pretended not to notice, choosing the safety of silence over confrontation. She whispered something, her voice trembling, but the manager's reply was cold, final, and loud enough for the CEO to hear. "If you can't handle this job, you should walk out that door right now." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The waitress stood frozen, her tray slipping slightly in her hand, her shoulders shaking. The undercover CEO pushed back his chair slowly, his instincts screaming at him to step in, to put an end to this. Yet he hesitated, his identity still hidden. his mind racing through the weight of what revealing himself would mean. He wasn't just a stranger here. He was the very man who had promised to protect employees like her. And now, everything was boiling to a moment where silence was no longer an option. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The staff glanced nervously toward the scene, the customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the CEO stood just a few feet away. His jaw tight, his hands clenched. This was the moment he could no longer ignore. But how he acted next would change everything. For the waitress, for the staff, and for the company he had built. And as the tension reached its breaking point, the Undercover CEO took his first step forward. The Undercover CEO's footsteps were steady as he moved closer, but before he could say a word, the restaurant's front door swung open with a sharp creak. A woman in a dark coat hurried inside, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the waitress. The young woman's face went pale at the sight, her body stiffening as if she'd just been caught in a secret she hadn't wanted revealed. The room's attention shifted, whispers breaking out as the stranger walked directly toward her. The CEO paused, caught off guard. He expected the next few moments to be between himself, the manager, and the waitress, but this sudden arrival shifted everything. The stranger reached the waitress, speaking in a low but urgent voice. Though the CEO couldn't hear every word, fragments carried across the floor. Rent, late, and can't wait any longer. The waitress's eyes filled with tears, and her lips parted as though she wanted to explain, but no explanation came. The manager smirked coldly, as if her personal struggle confirmed his view that she didn't belong here. The CEO's chest tightened. It wasn't just about workplace treatment anymore. This young woman wasn't only battling a harsh manager. She was carrying the crushing weight of her life outside these walls. And now, that burden was spilling into the restaurant, exposed in front of strangers and customers. He realized the stakes were far greater than he'd imagined. This wasn't simply a matter of company culture. It was about survival, about dignity, about whether his employees were seen as people or just parts of a system designed to generate profit. As the confrontation unfolded, another layer of unease spread across the staff. The older waitress exchanged a look with the busboy, a silent message passing between them. They weren't surprised by what was happening. It was almost as if they had been expecting something like this, as if the young waitress wasn't the first to be pushed this far. The CEO caught that look, and it chilled him. How long had this been happening under his nose? How many employees had been silenced, ignored, or quietly pushed out while he sat comfortably in his office, trusting the wrong people to manage the right values? Then came the twist he hadn't anticipated. From the kitchen, another voice rose, louder this time, firm with frustration. A cook stepped out, his apron still dusted with flour, his hands trembling with anger. "Enough," he muttered, though the word carried across the room. The manager turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. But before he could speak, the cook continued. "We're all tired of this. Of being treated like we don't matter. She's not the only one." The restaurant fell into silence. Customers shifted uncomfortably, some whispering, others staring at their plates. The CEO's pulse raced. This was no longer just about one waitress. It was an uprising waiting to happen. The young woman stood frozen, torn between shame and relief, while the manager's face flushed with fury, struggling to keep control of the situation spiraling in front of paying guests. And in the center of it all stood the Undercover CEO. His cover still intact, yet his identity pressing against him like a secret too heavy to hold any longer. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. What he had just witnessed would change not only this restaurant, but the future of his company. But before he could take another step forward, the manager's voice cut through the air, louder than before, filled with anger and desperation. And in that moment, the CEO realized the night wasn't anywhere near its breaking point. It was only just beginning. The manager's voice boomed across the restaurant, his words sharp and commanding, ordering the cook back into the kitchen and the waitress off the floor. The room went still, the air thick with unease. Customers shifted in their seats, unsure if they should intervene or stay silent. The young waitress stood frozen, her face pale and wet with tears, her tray trembling in her hand. The cook clenched his fists but didn't move. The staff looked to one another, waiting for someone, anyone, to take a stand. That was the moment the Undercover CEO finally stepped forward. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound cutting through the silence. Every head turned as he walked toward the center of the storm, his expression calm but unyielding. 4 hours he had remained hidden, just another customer in the corner. But the time for observing was over. His voice carried across the room, steady and controlled. "Enough," he said. "This ends now." The manager spun around, his eyes narrowing in irritation. "Sir, this is none of your business," he snapped. But before he could go further, the CEO's next words silenced the room. "It's very much my business. Because this isn't just a restaurant to me. This is my restaurant." The words landed like thunder. Gasps rippled across the room. The staff froze, wide-eyed, and the manager's face drained of color. The waitress's lips parted in shock, her tears forgotten for a moment as she stared at him in disbelief. Even the customers leaned forward, whispering to each other, realizing they had been dining alongside the very man who owned the place. The CEO's gaze locked onto the manager, sharp and unwavering. "I built this company on values of respect, dignity, and family," he said firmly. "And what I've witnessed tonight is the exact opposite of everything I stand for." His words echoed, leaving no room for doubt. The manager stammered, his authority crumbling, his excuses faltering under the weight of truth. Then the CEO turned to the waitress. His voice softened, but it carried the same power. "You deserve better than this. Every single person working here deserves better. And starting now, things will change." The staff exchanged glances, a flicker of hope breaking through their shock. The cook nodded slightly, his earlier anger replaced with quiet relief. But just as the tension began to ease, the unexpected twist came. The woman in the dark coat, the one who had confronted the waitress earlier, stepped forward again. Her eyes locked on the CEO, sharp and unflinching. "If you really are who you say you are," she said slowly, "then you should know it's not just this restaurant. What's happening here is happening in others too." The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words hanging heavy. The CEO's breath caught in his chest. He had come undercover to one location, thinking he might uncover small issues or hidden challenges. But now he realized the problem wasn't isolated. It could be woven into the very fabric of the empire he had built. The truth was bigger, deeper, and far more dangerous than he had imagined. The waitress looked at him with pleading eyes. The staff waited in silence, and the customers held their breath. The CEO stood at the crossroads of revelation, his identity no longer hidden, his company's future hanging in the balance. And as the night reached its peak, one thing became clear. The story wasn't ending here. It was only the beginning of a reckoning that would shake everything he thought he knew. The restaurant was still in silence when the CEO finally spoke again. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had just uncovered more than he had bargained for. He looked around at the staff, then at the customers who had unknowingly become witnesses to the truth. "What I saw tonight cannot be ignored," he said. "And what I just heard makes it clear this isn't just one location's problem. It's a company-wide issue, and that's on me." The staff exchanged stunned looks. For years they had felt invisible, their struggles tucked away behind polished smiles and long shifts. Now, their voices were being heard not by a stranger but by the very person who had the power to change everything. The waitress, still trembling, lowered her eyes, unsure whether to believe what she was hearing. But when the CEO turned to her, his expression softened. "You are not weak," he said gently. "You've been carrying burdens no one else cared to see. And from this moment, you won't carry them alone." The manager, pale and shaken, tried to mutter an excuse, but the CEO stopped him cold. "I trusted you to lead with integrity. Instead you led with fear. This ends tonight." His words were final. The staff stood taller, almost in disbelief, watching as the balance of power shifted before their eyes. The man they feared had just been stripped of his authority, and for the first time, hope flickered across their faces. The cook stepped forward, wiping his flour-dusted hands nervously. "Does this mean things will change? For all of us?" His voice was cautious but steady. The CEO nodded. "Yes, change starts here. Fair schedules, fair treatment, fair pay. No more silencing. No more fear." The staff let out a collective breath, as though years of weight had lifted in that single moment. The woman in the dark coat, who had revealed the deeper truth, gave a small, approving nod. "Then make sure you don't just fix this place. Fix all of them." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and the CEO accepted it with a solemn nod. He had built his company on a dream of opportunity, but somewhere along the way, that dream had been buried under profit sheets and policies. Tonight had reminded him of what truly mattered: people. The customers, who had watched in stunned silence, began to applaud softly, the sound growing stronger until the entire room echoed with it. The waitress stood in the center, tears streaming down her face, not of despair this time but of relief. For the first time in a long while she felt seen. The CEO looked around the restaurant one last time, his eyes resting on the staff who had carried so much for so long. "This company isn't just mine," he said. "It's ours. And it will only stand strong if every single person here stands with it." His words weren't rehearsed or polished. They were raw, real, and spoken from the heart. That night ended not with anger or despair, but with a quiet promise of change. The staff left with lighter steps, the customers walked out with a story they would never forget, and the CEO stepped into the night carrying the weight of responsibility he had almost forgotten. The story of an undercover CEO walking into his own restaurant had begun as a simple observation, but it ended as a turning point, not just for one waitress in tears, but for an entire company. And as the lights dimmed in the restaurant, one truth lingered in the air: success is never measured by profits alone, but by how we treat the people who help build the dream.